The history books got the age of exploration completely wrong. You know the famous names, the celebrated adventurers, but they were not the true architects of this world-changing era. The real power lay with a hidden network of merchant dynasties, families whose immense wealth and quiet influence secretly funded the voyages and charted the maps that reshaped our entire globe. By the end of this story, you will understand how the flow of capital, not the courage of explorers, redirected the course of human history. How did a banking family from Germany come to rule a colony in South America? Why did the pursuit of pepper quietly dictate which shores were discovered first? We will pull back the curtain on these shadowy financiers, from the counting houses of Augsburg to the spice routes of the Indies, to uncover the clandestine deals that truly steered our past. What does it mean when the future of continents is decided not in a throne room, but in a bookkeeper's office? That insatiable demand for spices was far more than a simple culinary preference. It was a powerful economic force, one that could make or break entire kingdoms. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, these were not just seasonings, they were symbols of status, essential preservatives, and believed cures for illness. Controlling their supply meant controlling a river of pure wealth. Yet in the mid-15th century, that river was suddenly dammed. The historic city of Constantinople, the great fell to a new power. This event severed the ancient overland trade arteries that had reliably fed spices into European markets for centuries. The result was immediate and dramatic. Prices for these precious goods skyrocketed overnight. A kingdom's treasury could be drained simply by stocking its royal kitchens. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-blown economic crisis for the elites of Europe. Kings and queens desperately needed a new route to the source, but their coffers were often tied up in wars, palaces, and the immense cost of simply governing. They had the authority, but they frequently lacked the liquid capital and the specialized international financial networks to bankroll such a risky, long-term gamble. This created a power vacuum, a void between royal ambition and practical execution. And waiting in the wings with ledgers open and networks humming were the merchant dynasties. These families were not bound by borders in the same way kings were. A banker in Augsburg had trusted agents in Venice, Lisbon, and Antwerp. They had pioneered the tools for this exact moment. The bill of exchange, a sort of medieval traveler's check, allowed money to move across continents without the physical, dangerous transport of gold. Even more revolutionary was the concept of the joint stock company. This was a financial masterstroke. It allowed many investors to pool their resources, spreading the immense risk of a multi-year voyage across dozens of backers instead of resting it on one king's treasury. If a ship sank, the loss was shared and survivable. If it returned laden with spice, the profits were multiplied and distributed. The merchant bankers possessed the three things the age demanded: vast reserves of risk capital, a spider web of global connections, and these sophisticated financial instruments. So when a sea captain with a bold map and a hungry crew came looking for patronage, he often found a more receptive audience in a quiet counting house than in an echoing throne room. The stage was now set. The players knew their roles. The monarchs would provide the flags and the royal charters, the public face of exploration. But the merchants, they would provide the lifeblood, the money, and in doing so, they would quietly begin to steer the entire endeavor. To understand the sheer scale of their influence, you have to step inside the Fugger house. This was not a simple office. It was a nerve center of European power, a place where the rustle of a ledger page could be louder than the march of an army. Here, Jakob Fugger, a man whose very nickname was the Rich, orchestrated a financial machine of breathtaking complexity. His primary clients were the Habsburgs, the family that ruled the sprawling Holy Roman Empire and would soon see its scion, Charles V, inherit a realm where the sun never set. Kings and emperors have endless ambitions but finite treasuries, and their constant wars and lavish courts created a bottomless need for cash. The Fuggers provided it, loan after enormous loan. But this was not charity, it was a calculated exchange. The Fuggers operated on a simple, brutal principle: debt is leverage. When the Habsburg treasury was empty, which was often, repayment came not just in gold but in rights and privileges. The most famous of these deals granted the Fuggers a monopoly over the immensely productive silver and copper mines of Tyrol. Think about that for a moment. A private family, through the power of debt, gained control over the primary sources of Europe's monetary metals. Silver and copper were the physical foundation of currency, the very substance that allowed kingdoms to mint coins and pay for everything from soldiers' wages to shipwrights' labor. By controlling the mines, the Fuggers didn't just have wealth, they influenced the economic bloodstream of the continent. When Charles V needed to finance his global ambitions, including the expeditions crossing the Atlantic, his ability to do so rested on a stable currency and access to credit, a system propped up by Fugger silver. So while the Fugger name never appears on a ship's manifest bound for the Indies, their fingerprints are all over the coins that paid for its rigging, its supplies, and its sailors. They demonstrated a fundamental truth of the era: the path to the New World was paved not just with navigational charts, but with promissory notes and mining contracts. The explorer might get the glory, but the banker held the keys to the treasury that made the glory possible. But wealth alone did not guarantee control of the future. You also needed to control the story, the very understanding of the world. This is where another dynasty, operating from the sun-drenched palazzos of Florence, mastered a different kind of currency. The Medici family is celebrated for birthing the Renaissance, for funding the art of Botticelli and the genius of Leonardo. Yet behind every magnificent fresco and marble sculpture was their formidable banking empire, a network that did more than finance beauty. It quietly financed the expansion of human knowledge itself. Their branches stretched from London to Constantinople, acting as nerve endings that collected more than debt repayments. They gathered whispers, rumors, and most importantly, hard geographic data. While Cosimo de' Medici commissioned breathtaking chapels, he was also amassing a different kind of treasure in his private study, a collection of the most accurate maps and sailors' logs available anywhere in Europe. His library became a clandestine clearinghouse for navigational intelligence. Think of a Medici agent in Lisbon settling a trade deal over fine Italian cloth. In the course of business, he might hear a Portuguese sea captain, emboldened by wine, speak of a new coastline he had charted far to the west. That fragment of information, scribbled in a coded letter and sent back to Florence, was as valuable as a chest of gold. It was a futures contract written in longitude and latitude. The Medicis understood that in the Renaissance, cultural influence and political access were two sides of the same golden coin. By bankrolling the Vatican and maintaining a web of diplomats and ambassadors, they secured a front-row seat to history. Popes received confidential reports from explorers who had sworn oaths to foreign kings. Through their unique position, the Medicis often saw those reports first. Their patronage was a brilliant, long-term strategy. Funding an artist like Michelangelo bought immortal prestige, but funding the acquisition of a secret Portolan chart bought actionable commercial insight. It meant knowing where the next spice route might be secured, where the next valuable colony could be planted years before their competitors. For them, a map was not just a picture, it was a business plan. The Medicis demonstrate that the redirection of exploration was not only fueled by silver and credit, but by information carefully curated and strategically deployed. They turned knowledge into a weapon of soft power, proving that the future belonged to those who could finance not just ships, but the very ideas of where those ships should sail. Yet the ultimate expression of this financial power was not a loan or a map, but an entire continent. To settle an impossibly large debt, Emperor Charles V signed away a piece of the New World itself. The creditor was the Welser family of Augsburg, rival bankers to the Fuggers, and the collateral was the province of Venezuela, a territory larger than their German homeland. Overnight, a merchant house became a colonial government. The Welsers were not explorers seeking glory for crown or cross. They were executives dispatched by a board of directors. Their charter granted them the right to found cities, appoint judges, and raise armies, all in the name of the Spanish crown, but all in pursuit of a single corporate objective: profit. Their mission, as dictated by their ledgers, was to locate the source of the legendary wealth rumored to be inland, the fabled city of El Dorado. This was exploration stripped of any pretense, a purely financial venture into the unknown. The Welser governors operated with a chilling efficiency, viewing the land and its people not as a kingdom to be integrated, but as assets to be managed and liabilities to be controlled. Their expeditions were less about discovery and more about resource extraction on a staggering scale, searching for gold mines and slave labor to balance the books back in Augsburg. The hardship inflicted during this period is well documented by historians, a stark reminder of the human cost when exploration is governed solely by a balance sheet. This startling chapter reveals the logical, terrifying endpoint of the merchant dynasty's influence. When royal debt grew too immense, the repayment could be the sovereign power itself, leased out to a private firm. The Welsers in Venezuela demonstrate that the redirection of exploration could go beyond influencing voyages. It could literally purchase the authority to rule them. Here, the map was not just a business plan, it was a corporate charter, and the frontier was a spreadsheet waiting to be filled. This quiet transaction between king and creditor created a hidden engine that drove the entire age forward. The royal charter, that grand parchment bearing a monarch's seal and granting authority to explore and claim new lands, was not a gift of pure patronage. It was, in its essence, a complex financial contract. When a monarch like Portugal's king or Spain's queen signed such a document, they were often doing so with money already spent, money they had borrowed from the very merchant families whose ships would fly their flag. The charter was less a command and more a concession, a legally binding promise that granted the financiers exclusive rights to profit from whatever was found. In exchange for bearing the staggering upfront cost of building and supplying ocean-going vessels, the bankers demanded and received monopolies. These weren't just favorable trade deals, they were total commercial control. A single family or syndicate could be granted the sole right to import all pepper from the East Indies, or all sugar from Brazil, or all silver from a specific region of the Americas. This turned the vast, unknown world into a series of locked financial portfolios. The pursuit of knowledge became secondary to the pursuit of market dominance. A coastline that offered beautiful harbors or curious new cultures but no immediately obvious source of wealth might be charted and then ignored for decades. In contrast, a rumor of a mountain of gold or a forest of spice trees would trigger a frantic, well-funded race. The routes on the map began to trace the lines of projected profit margins. Why did the Portuguese focus so intensely on rounding Africa to reach the Indian Ocean spice markets? Because the arithmetic was clear. The markup on a shipload of pepper could be thousands of %, a return so spectacular it justified years of perilous investment. Why did the Spanish crown, deep in debt to German and Genoese bankers, push relentlessly into the heart of South America? Because the promise of mineral wealth, of gold and silver mines, was the only asset that could realistically settle their towering obligations. This system created a powerful, often ruthless incentive. Exploration was no longer a sovereign mission for God and country alone. It was a high-stakes venture capital operation. The bankers sitting in their distant counting houses were not betting on the glory of a captain, they were betting on the yield of a commodity. This financial lens reshaped priorities on the ground. Expeditions were pressured to find not just new lands, but immediately exploitable resources to satisfy their distant investors. The slow, careful work of building relationships or mapping ecosystems held little value on a balance sheet that demanded a rapid return. The age of discovery, therefore, was also the age of the first global corporations, entities whose power derived not from a crown but from a credit line. The true map of the world being unveiled was, in a very real sense, a map of debt obligations and exclusive trading rights, drawn in ink long before the ships ever left the harbor. The ledger books of the age had 3 primary columns, and each tells a story of redirected human destiny. The first and most famous was filled with spices. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, these were the original targets, the glittering prizes that first pulled European ships beyond the horizon. For the merchant dynasties, this was a straightforward calculation of monopoly and margin. The old Venetian and Arab-controlled routes overland were slow, politically unstable, and expensive. Funding a Portuguese captain to find a sea route around Africa was a monumental risk, but the potential payoff was absolute control. If successful, one fleet could bypass every middleman and bring spices directly from the source to Lisbon, slashing costs and seizing the entire market. The capital flowed and the ships sailed not for national pride, but to corner a global commodity market. The destination of those early caravels was not chosen for curiosity. It was chosen by a profit and loss statement written in a merchant's office hundreds of miles from the sea. Then the equation changed dramatically. Spanish expeditions, funded by those same webs of credit, stumbled upon a different kind of treasure in the Americas, not aromatic tree bark, but literal mountains of silver. The discovery of vast deposits at Potosi and elsewhere triggered a financial pivot of historic scale. Silver was not a luxury, it was money itself, the universal currency. Suddenly, the merchant bankers were not just funding trade, they were funding the minting of the world's primary medium of exchange. This created a breathtaking, circular flow of wealth they were uniquely positioned to manage. Spanish galleons carried American silver across the Atlantic to Seville, where German and Italian bankers took their share to settle royal debts. That same silver was then shipped onward, financing Portuguese and later Dutch voyages to Asia, where it was used to buy the very spices that had started the whole endeavor. The merchant dynasties, with their international networks, operated the valves in this system. They decided how much silver flowed east and how many spices flowed west, mastering the first truly global monetary system. This machinery of extraction, however, required fuel, a terrible and relentless kind of fuel. To work the silver mines and the burgeoning sugar plantations of the New World, a colossal labor force was needed, one that would not succumb to local illness and could be ruthlessly managed as a financial asset. Thus, the third column in the ledger was opened, one that recorded human lives as units of capital. The transatlantic system of forced labor that developed was not a separate tragedy. It was the integrated, brutal final component of the financial model. The same banking houses that insured spice cargoes and underwrote mining expeditions also provided the capital and insurance policies for slave ships. They turned an atrocity into an actuarial table, calculating risks and returns on human cargo with the same dispassionate efficiency they applied to a shipment of pepper. This completed a devastating triangle of profit. European manufactured goods were traded for captured individuals on the African coast. Those individuals were transported across the ocean to produce raw materials, sugar, tobacco, and the silver that mined the wealth. Those commodities were then shipped back to Europe to generate the capital to begin the cycle again. Each point of the triangle was financed, insured, and profited from by the invisible hand of merchant capital. The destinations on the map, from the spice islands of the Moluccas to the silver peaks of the Andes to the plantation coasts of the Caribbean, were all connected by lines of credit that viewed every resource, even human life, through the cold lens of commodification. This was the hidden architecture of the so-called Age of Discovery, a global engine built on ledgers and powered by unimaginable human cost. But how did these distant bankers know where to place their bets? They built a web of whispers. In an era where a letter could take months to cross a continent, timely, accurate information was a form of currency more valuable than gold. The great merchant houses operated the world's first truly private, global intelligence networks. Their agents, known as factors, were not mere salesmen. They were highly trusted operatives stationed in every major port and trading hub, from the bustling docks of Lisbon and Seville to the ancient spice markets of Alexandria and the financial exchanges of Antwerp. Their official duty was to manage trade goods and settle accounts. Their unofficial and far more critical mission was to gather intelligence. Every rumor was a data point. A whispered conversation overheard in a Lisbon tavern about a ship's delayed return from the African coast. A secret glance at a new Portolan chart in a Seville cartographer's workshop. A report from a local contact about shifting political alliances with a coastal kingdom, or news of a previously unknown stretch of coastline spotted by a rival's vessel. These fragments of information, scribbled in coded letters and sent via trusted couriers along established commercial routes, flowed back to the family's headquarters. There, senior partners would piece them together like a vast, living mosaic of the world. This private espionage apparatus often operated with an efficiency that state intelligence services, bogged down by court politics and rigid hierarchies, could not match. A king's spy might be looking for military threats or political conspiracies. A merchant's agent was looking for something more precise, market advantage. A detailed report on seasonal wind patterns in the Indian Ocean could determine the optimal departure date for a fleet, turning a risky voyage into a profitable one. News of a local leader's openness to trade, or conversely, of a fortified harbor and hostile reception, allowed bankers to calculate risk with startling accuracy. This flow of knowledge created a powerful feedback loop. The intelligence gathered by these factors directly influenced where the next infusion of capital would go. If reports from Alexandria suggested the overland spice caravans were becoming more reliable again, a banker might pull funding from a speculative Portuguese voyage around Africa, deeming it too risky. Conversely, a thrilling, clandestine report from a factor in the Moluccas about a glut of nutmeg and low local prices would trigger a frenzy of investment to dispatch the fastest ships possible. The Crown might issue the official charter and provide the public justification, but the merchant dynasties, through their private information network, often curated the knowledge that made the expedition feasible in the first place. They didn't just react to the age of exploration, they used information to actively steer it, deciding in quiet counting houses which corners of the map were worth illuminating next. The voyage of Vasco da Gama was a financial tightrope walk across an unknown ocean. While King Manuel I of Portugal provided the royal mandate and the public vision, the staggering practical costs fell to a silent consortium of bankers. Italian and German merchant houses, including the Fuggers and the Florentine Marchionne family, advanced the enormous sums needed to outfit the small fleet. They paid for the sturdy caravels, the months of supplies for the crew, and the chests of trade goods meant to impress distant rulers. This was not a grant, it was a high-stakes loan with the entire world as collateral. The bankers were betting on the king's promise, a promise that if da Gama succeeded, Portugal would claim an exclusive monopoly over the entire sea route to the spice markets of India. For these financiers, da Gama was not just an explorer, He was the lead agent in a speculative venture. His mission was to secure the supply chain. When his ships finally limped back to Lisbon in 1499, their holds filled with pepper and cinnamon, they carried more than spices. They carried proof of concept. The sea route was real, and the investment model was validated. The profit from that single voyage repaid the entire cost of the expedition 50 times over. This astronomical return sent a shockwave through the financial centers of Europe. It proved that funding exploration could be the most lucrative investment in history. The Portuguese crown quickly moved to institutionalize this success, establishing the Estado da India. This was not a traditional empire of conquered lands and settled colonists. It was a network, a corporate supply chain made physical. Fortified trading posts called factories were built at strategic points along the route, from the coast of Africa to the harbors of India. Their purpose was singular: to control the flow of spice. They were secure warehouses and negotiation centers, protected by royal soldiers but financed and supplied through the continuous flow of private capital. The king provided the cannons, but the merchants provided the coins that bought the cannonballs. This system created a bizarre and powerful hybrid. A nation-state acted like a publicly traded company, its foreign policy dictated by commodity prices and shareholder return. The destination of every Portuguese carrack was decided by a balance between royal ambition and banker's ledger. This quiet partnership between crown and capital, pioneered on da Gama's voyage, became the blueprint. It showed that the future of global exploration would be written not just in sea charts, but in partnership agreements and profit-sharing contracts. Christopher Columbus was a man with a map and a ledger. His celebrated voyage, so often framed as a triumph of individual genius and royal patronage, was in cold financial terms a high-risk startup pitch. For years, he shopped his business plan across the courts of Europe, a plan based on a critical miscalculation. Columbus insisted the Earth was far smaller than most scholars believed, meaning a westward sail to the riches of Asia would be short and profitable. Portugal's king, advised by experts with better data, saw the flaw and declined the investment. Columbus was not a lone visionary being ignored. He was an entrepreneur with a faulty prospectus. His eventual success in Spain had little to do with convincing Queen Isabella of his geographic theory, and everything to do with convincing her treasurer. Enter Luis de Santangel, a royal financier whose family had deep roots in Valencia's merchant community. He saw potential where the monarch saw only risk. With a royal treasury strained from the recent conclusion of a long conflict on the Iberian Peninsula, Santangel personally advanced the equivalent of nearly half the voyage's cost. He did not do this out of faith in Columbus' navigation, but out of faith in the business model. The initial investment was modest, roughly what the crown might spend on a modest diplomatic banquet. But the potential return, a monopoly on a direct westward trade route to the Spice Kingdoms, was a financial fantasy made real. This was not a sovereign mission commanded by a queen. It was a speculative venture funded by angel investors embedded within the court itself. These men, like Santangel, were the crucial link, individuals whose personal wealth was intertwined with the larger, invisible networks of Mediterranean and European finance. They provided the bridge between a desperate salesman and a cash-poor crown. When Columbus' tiny fleet finally set sail, it was not just carrying the flags of Spain, it was carrying the capital of courtiers who had bet their personal fortunes on a geographic error. His voyage, therefore, stands as the perfect enigma of the age. It was a monumental historical accident, landing in an entirely new world while searching for a known one, all made possible because a small group of financiers calculated that the reward was worth the risk. The discovery of the Americas, arguably the most consequential geographic event in modern history, began not with a royal decree, but with a promissory note signed by a banker. The line drawn across the Atlantic in 1494 was not merely a political boundary, it was a financial firewall. We remember the Treaty of Tordesillas as a grand diplomatic feat, where Pope Alexander VI divided the unexplored world between Spain and Portugal with a stroke of his pen. But the Pope was not just a spiritual arbiter, he was a man deeply entangled in the financial webs of his time, his own election famously bankrolled by the same Genos merchant families who had interests on both sides of the negotiation. This was not simply Spain versus Portugal. It was a consortium of bankers backing Lisbon's established African and Indian Ocean ventures, sitting across the table from the syndicate of creditors who had just bet on Columbus and the vast, uncertain Atlantic. Their primary concern was not national glory, but market stability. A chaotic, violent scramble between the two crowns would have been a financial disaster, sinking ships, destroying trading posts, and causing wild fluctuations in the price of the very commodities that backed their loans. The treaty, therefore, was a risk management strategy disguised as a papal decree. The specific longitudinal line they argued over for days was not chosen by celestial calculation alone, but by cold commercial logic. Pushing it further west gave Portugal's backers security, protecting their monopoly on the lucrative route around Africa to the Spice Islands. Granting more eastern territory to Spain appeased Columbus's creditors, offering them a larger exclusive zone in the Atlantic to recoup their investment and search for new sources of wealth. The world was not being divided for God or king, but to create orderly, monopolistic markets for the benefit of distant shareholders. This quiet reality reframes the entire age. The great imperial rivalry that would define centuries was, in its infancy, a boardroom negotiation between international creditor syndicates, calmly managing their collective global portfolio. The Indian Ocean was not a blank slate awaiting European discovery. It was a vibrant, ancient economic superhighway, humming with activity for over 1,000 years. When Portuguese carracks first rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered these waters, their crews were not gazing upon a primitive wilderness. They were staring, slack-jawed, at a commercial ecosystem more complex and fluid than anything in Europe. This was a world ruled not by kings with armies, but by merchant princes with ledgers. In ports like Calicut on India's Malabar coast, or the legendary entrepot of Malacca, trade was a finely tuned ballet. Arab dhow captains, Gujarati spice wholesalers, Malay harbour masters, and Chinese porcelain merchants all operated within a web of unwritten rules, familial bonds, and intricate credit arrangements that stretched from the coast of Africa to the islands of Indonesia. Their wealth was built not on hoarded bullion, but on trust and reputation. A merchant in Hormuz could secure a shipment of pearls bound for Cairo with nothing but a handwritten promise, a system of hundi or saftojal, letters of credit, that moved vast sums across continents without a single coin changing hands. This was the system Europe's hidden financiers suddenly sought to enter. The initial goal was not to conquer this world, for that was impossible with a handful of ships. The goal was to insert themselves into its profitable currents. They had one irresistible tool, American silver. In a trust-based economy, the sudden injection of massive amounts of hard, tangible currency was a seismic event. European captains, funded by their distant bankers, used this silver like a battering ram against the gates of established trade. They could pay upfront in cash for pepper and cinnamon, bypassing the long credit cycles of the local networks. This was their foot in the door. But the real aim, the grand design whispered in the counting houses of Lisbon and Antwerp, was far more ambitious. They did not want to join the existing system. They wanted to rewire it, to cut out the powerful middlemen who took a slice of profit at every port. Why pay a Gujarati broker in Calicut, who then paid an Arab shipper, who then dealt with a producer in the Moluccas, when a single, well-armed Portuguese carrack could sail directly to the source and claim the entire markup for its investors back home? This encounter, then, was a profound clash of financial philosophies. On one side was a centuries-old, decentralized, relationship-driven model of commerce. On the other was a new, centralized, capital-intensive model fueled by Atlantic silver and shareholder demand. The European age of exploration in the East was, in essence, a hostile corporate takeover attempt, funded by New World mines and directed from European financial centers. The forts they built were not just military outposts, they were secure corporate warehouses designed to control the choke points of this ancient highway and redirect its wealth into a new European-controlled ledger. Yet that silver and those spices arrived in European ports stained with a reality the financiers never saw. The promissory notes signed in quiet offices were not just contracts, they were invisible chains. For every chest of pepper unloaded in Lisbon, there was a story of conflict on a distant shore. For every ingot of silver melted down in Seville, there was a narrative of immense hardship in a mountain mine thousands of miles away. The merchant dynasties mastered a dangerous kind of arithmetic, one where profit was calculated in one column, and the human cost was neatly omitted from the ledger. This was the core of their power and their lasting shadow, the ability to fund world-altering ventures while remaining ethically divorced from their consequences. They provided the capital for systems of extraction, but never had to witness the extraction itself. A loan to the Spanish crown for a new mining expedition in the Americas was, on paper, a simple financial instrument. It appeared in the books as an asset, a number that would hopefully grow. But that capital was the fuel for the encomienda system, a grant of land and the labor of the people who lived on it. The investor in Augsburg saw only the interest payment, not the forced labor that produced the silver to make that payment possible. Similarly, the capital that flowed into establishing sugar plantations in the Caribbean created an economic model with a voracious appetite. Plantations were not small farms, they were large-scale industrial operations requiring massive upfront investment in land, machinery, and labor. The merchant bankers, through bonds and company shares, provided that seed money. Their return was guaranteed by the yield of the crop, a yield that depended entirely on a brutal system of forced, relentless toil. The financier could collect dividends from the sale of sugar in London or Amsterdam, comfortably separated by an ocean from the suffering that produced it. This separation was not an accident, it was the system's design. It allowed for a clean conscience in the counting house because the violence was outsourced, first to the crown and its conquistadors, and then to the plantation managers and overseers on the ground. The moral burden was diffused across a chain of responsibility so long that the original source of the capital felt no weight at all. This ethical divorce created a template, a blueprint for how global capital could engage with the world for centuries to come. It established that immense profit could be pursued by funding enterprises at a distance, where the investor's connection to the human and environmental cost was reduced to a line on a balance sheet. The legacy of these dynasties, therefore, is not just in the maps they helped draw, but in this chilling financial precedent, the notion that wealth could be built by strategically not seeing, by funding the engine while ignoring the sound of its gears. To see this hidden machinery in perfect motion, look no further than a single, dull-colored metal. The Fugger family's control over the copper mines of Central Europe was not just a source of wealth, it was a masterclass in global leverage. Copper in the 15th and 16th centuries was not merely an industrial metal, it was a form of money, a commodity whose value was recognized on opposite sides of the world. The Fuggers, by holding a near monopoly on its largest European sources, essentially controlled a global currency mint, and they spent this currency with breathtaking strategic precision, creating a closed financial loop that powered the age. In the kingdoms of West Africa, copper was prized above almost all else. Artisans transformed it into beautiful, intricate objects, and it held deep cultural and economic significance. For Portuguese traders arriving on the coast, this created a perfect opportunity. They could trade Fugger copper shipped south from Antwerp for the one thing Europe desperately lacked: African gold. This gold was not for jewelry alone. It was the essential capital that flowed back to Lisbon, allowing the Portuguese crown to finance its next fleet of spice-laden carracks bound for India. So already a chain was forged. A European metal mined by Fugger-controlled labor was traded for African gold that funded Asian voyages, but the Fuggers did not stop there. They saw the other end of the journey with equal clarity. In the markets of India, copper was in high demand for practical reasons, crafted into cooking vessels and, crucially, into lightweight field cannons. So the Fuggers sent another stream of their copper not west to Africa, but east, around the Cape of Good Hope to India itself. There it was sold directly, generating immense profits that could be reinvested or repatriated. Now step back and trace the entire circuit. Copper mined in Hungary under the Fugger banner travels south to Africa to be exchanged for gold. That gold travels west to Portugal to buy spices. Meanwhile, more Fugger copper travels east to India to be sold for profit, in the very markets those spices came from. One family, sitting in a German office, had created a triangular trade in metal and spice that connected Central Europe, West Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Their ledger entries were not isolated transactions. They were the connective tissue of a new world economy. A payment for miners' tools in Tyrol was intrinsically linked to the price of pepper in Calicut. This is the mechanism laid bare, not in theory, but in the cold, hard reality of a copper ingot's journey. The Fuggers did not need to command armies or captain ships. They simply controlled a resource that everyone, everywhere wanted, and in doing so, they quietly pulled the financial strings that made the entire system turn. A debt to a king is the most dangerous investment in the world. The merchant dynasties had built their empires on the premise that royal power could be leveraged, that crowns would always need their gold and would honor their obligations. This was the fundamental risk they accepted, and in the end it proved fatal. The Spanish monarchy, the Fuggers' greatest client, was a financial black hole. Its ambitions were global, from fighting wars in the Netherlands to maintaining fleets across 2 oceans, and it spent money with a breathtaking disregard for income. To fund this, it borrowed relentlessly from its German bankers, pledging future shipments of American silver as collateral. The Fuggers and Welsers became trapped in a cycle of their own making. Each new loan was necessary to ensure repayment of the last one, a desperate pyramid scheme built on imperial overreach. Then, in 1557, the unthinkable happened. Facing obligations it could not possibly meet, the Spanish crown declared a cessación de pagos, a sovereign default. It simply stopped paying. The announcement, delivered not with a battle cry but with a fiscal decree, was a financial earthquake. Vast fortunes, painstakingly accumulated over generations, were erased overnight as royal promises turned to worthless paper. The Fuggers, once the richest family in Europe, saw their wealth evaporate into the thin air of royal insolvency. They learned the brutal lesson that their financial influence had a hard ceiling, the absolute power of the state to walk away from its debts. No ledger could compel a king. No contract could bind an empire that decided its survival required breaking its word. This was the ultimate limit of their quiet power. They could redirect exploration, but they could not control the monarchs whose flags gave those explorations legitimacy. Their influence was a loan, not a title, and the crown could foreclose on it at any time. The model itself was also running out of fuel. The early, spectacular returns had come from first contact, from the immediate plunder of easily accessible wealth and the establishment of monopolies on unknown routes. But by the late 16th century, the low-hanging fruit was gone. The great silver mines required ever more complex and expensive infrastructure. The spice trade was no longer a Portuguese secret. As English and Dutch interlopers, backed by their own aggressive merchant syndicates, violently muscled into the markets, driving down prices and profits for everyone. The world was becoming crowded, competitive, and expensive. The dynasties, built for a moment of explosive, monopolistic growth, were not agile enough for this new era of fierce competition. They were overextended, their capital locked in bad debts to bankrupt kings, their traditional trade arteries under assault. New financial institutions were rising, like the Dutch East India Company, which perfected the joint stock model by truly separating the investor's risk from their personal fortune. The age of the personal, family-run financial superpower was ending, giving way to the age of the impersonal, state-chartered corporation. The dynasties did not vanish, but their world-shaping power faded. They had unlocked the globe with their capital, but in doing so, they created a system that eventually grew too large, too complex, and too risky for any single family to control. They proved that money could redirect history's course, but also that history, in the form of sovereign whim and shifting markets, could just as easily redirect the money. Their financial empires crumbled, but their blueprint for power remained. The great merchant dynasties proved that private capital could redirect history, but they also exposed the fatal flaw of a system built on personal relationships and sovereign debt. Their lasting contribution was not a specific fortune, but an organizational model, a financial architecture designed to conquer distance and risk. This architecture, perfected in their counting houses, would outlive them, evolving into the engine of the next phase of global domination, the joint stock company. Institutions like the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, known by its initials VOC, were not created in a vacuum. They were the direct, logical descendants of the Fugger and Medici way of doing business, but with a critical innovation. Where the Fuggers were a family firm, the VOC was a corporation owned by thousands of anonymous shareholders. It took the concept of pooling capital to an unprecedented scale, drawing investment from merchants, craftsmen, even widows and city magistrates, spreading the risk of long ocean voyages across an entire society. This was capital democratized and weaponized. The charter granted to the VOC by the Dutch government was a document of staggering power. It gave the company a legal monopoly over all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, but it went much further. The VOC was authorized to build forts, maintain armies and fleets, wage war, imprison individuals, negotiate treaties with foreign princes, and establish colonies. In essence, it was a sovereign state in corporate form, a merchant dynasty with the full coercive power of a nation behind it, yet accountable primarily to a board of directors and a balance sheet. This transition marks a pivotal, chilling moment in our story. The redirected course of exploration, once steered by the quiet influence of a few families over indebted monarchs, became fully institutionalized. The corporation itself became the explorer, the conqueror, and the ruler. The VOC's ships did not sail for king or country in any traditional sense. They sailed for shareholder value. Their governors in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, made decisions based on quarterly reports and profit margins, not imperial glory. When they clashed with Portuguese outposts or local kingdoms, it was not a war between nations, but a hostile takeover by a better-financed competitor. This was corporate colonialism, a system where the flag followed the trade, and the trade was dictated by a boardroom in Amsterdam. The family firms had leveraged royal debt to gain influence, but the joint stock company transcended that need. It became the state in its sphere of operation, merging financial and political power into a single, terrifyingly efficient entity. The ledger, once a tool of influence, was now the constitution of a new kind of empire. The true power of these dynasties was not just in their ledgers, but in the stone and mortar they left behind. Their wealth literally reshaped the skyline of Europe, creating a new geography of power written in architecture. In Augsburg, Jakob Fugger commissioned a unique project, the Fugger. Completed in 1521, it is recognized as the world's oldest social housing complex still in use. For a nominal annual rent, equivalent to one Rhenish guilder, Catholic craftsmen and their families could live in a clean, orderly community with its own church, walls, and gates. This was charity, yes, but it was also a profoundly strategic investment. By providing affordable, stable housing for skilled workers, the Fuggers were ensuring a reliable, healthy, and loyal workforce for their many local enterprises, from textile mills to administrative offices. It was social welfare engineered for economic stability, a physical manifestation of the Fugger principle that a secure community was a productive asset. Far to the south, in Florence, the Medici expressed their power through a different aesthetic. Their sprawling palazzos, like the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, were not merely lavish homes, they were statements of a new world order. The breathtaking art within, the frescoes, sculptures, and masterpieces by Donatello and Botticelli, were funded directly by the profits from wool, banking, and the alum trade. Every painted ceiling and marble courtyard whispered the same truth, that the highest achievements of Renaissance culture were underwritten by the gritty realities of international commerce. The palace was a bank vault for beauty, proving that capital could purchase not just goods but immortality. Yet the most telling structures were not the charitable housing or the artistic palaces, but the utilitarian giants built in the great port cities. In Seville, along the Guadalquivir River, and in Antwerp, along the Scheldt, rose enormous warehouses called almacines. These were cathedrals of commerce, their architecture devoid of ornament, designed for pure function, security, and efficiency. Their thick walls protected the treasures of empires, silver ingots from Potosi, cochineal dye from Mexico, and fragrant cinnamon from Ceylon. Their vast, open floors were orchestrated for the constant flow of goods, a ballet of stevedores and clerks moving commodities from ship to shelf to ledger. These warehouses were the physical nodes of the global network, the points where abstract capital on a balance sheet transformed into tangible, smellable, weighable wealth. They were the concrete endpoints of the financial lines that stretched across oceans, the silent, imposing proof that the destiny of distant continents was being unpacked, sorted, and repackaged right here on these damp European docks. The most enduring myth of the age is the solitary hero. We see the stern portrait, the resolute gaze fixed on a horizon only he can see. But that portrait was almost always commissioned and paid for after the fact. The reality was a web of obligation that began long before the first ship was even commissioned. The explorer did not simply walk into a royal court and walk out with a fleet. He arrived with a proposal, a business plan requiring capital. The ships themselves were not conjured from royal will. They were purchased on credit from shipyards whose owners needed assurances of payment from the crown's bankers. Every plank of oak, every bolt of canvas, every barrel of salted meat represented an entry in a ledger, an advance against future profits. The crew, those brave souls facing the unknown, were not volunteers in a pure sense of adventure. They were employees signing contracts for a share of the profits, their families often receiving a portion of their pay in advance to survive the years of their absence. This was not a voyage, it was a payroll. Even the seemingly humble trade goods loaded into the hold, the bolts of cloth, the strings of glass beads, the samples of metalwork, these were not royal gifts. They were inventory purchased on margin by merchant factors, intended as speculative currency to be exchanged for something of far greater value. The entire enterprise, from keel to crow's nest, was a floating financial instrument. So while the explorer faced the physical storm at sea, his financiers faced a different kind of tempest, one of fluctuating commodity prices, political instability back home, and the agonizing silence of years without word. Their courage was the courage of the speculator. betting a fortune on a single roll of dice with a 2-year lag before seeing the result. The glory of planting a flag on a distant shore was the triumphant climax of a story sold to the public. But the true, grinding work of the age happened in the quiet, sunlit rooms of notaries and accountants. Here, in documents dense with legal Latin, the voyage was meticulously constructed clause by clause. Contracts specified the exact percentage of profits owed to the silent partners, the insurance policies against loss, the penalties for captains who engaged in private trade. These dry, unromantic parchments were the real maps, charting the distribution of risk and reward. They determined what was worth discovering, because if a land had no resource that could be legally claimed, traded, and taxed under the terms of these agreements, it held no value for the machine that funded the journey. This reframes our understanding completely. The age of exploration was not a sudden awakening of curiosity. It was the cautious, deliberate extension of a credit line across a map. Each new coastline was not just a geographic discovery, it was a new line item on a balance sheet, an asset to be developed or a liability to be written off. The hero's journey was in its bones a quarterly report. The maps that guided these voyages were themselves products of investment. Gerardus Mercator, the brilliant Flemish cartographer, did not craft his revolutionary world map of 1569 in a dusty academic tower. His work was a direct response to the practical, urgent needs of the merchant and navigator. His famous projection, which represented lines of constant bearing as straight lines, was a monumental leap for sailors. It meant a captain could plot a straight course on the map and follow that same constant compass bearing across the open ocean, a vital simplification for long-distance travel. But such a complex, mathematically intensive project required time, resources, and patronage. That support often flowed from the same commercial circles whose ships would use his charts. Accurate maps were not scholarly curiosities, they were risk mitigation tools. A banker financing a spice fleet needed to know the most efficient route, the location of safe harbors, and the precise distances involved to calculate provisioning and insurance costs. An error on a chart could mean a ship running aground, a crew lost, and an entire investment sinking to the ocean floor. Funding a man like Mercator was, in essence, funding a form of maritime insurance. Every refined coastline on his parchment represented a reduced financial liability. The same logic drove the relentless improvement of the tools of navigation. The astrolabe and the cross-staff, used for centuries to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, were refined and made more robust for the brutal conditions of sea travel. The magnetic compass, that simple yet profound instrument, saw its housing and needle technology improve to provide more stable readings on a pitching deck. Who paid for these innovations? Very often, it was merchant consortiums or wealthy individual backers who understood that better instruments meant more reliable voyages, which meant more predictable profits. The greatest scientific puzzle of the age, however, was longitude. Determining how far east or west a ship had traveled was a fiendishly difficult problem that had baffled navigators for centuries. Without it, a captain in the vast Atlantic could only guess his position, leading to catastrophic miscalculations, missed landfalls, and tragic losses. The human cost of these errors was immense, with ships and entire crews vanishing. For the merchant financiers, each lost vessel was a financial disaster, a hole torn in their ledger representing not just lost cargo, but lost capital, lost insurance payouts, and shattered commercial timelines. The quest for a reliable method to find longitude at sea thus became one of history's first major publicly funded scientific prizes, driven overwhelmingly by commercial imperatives. Governments offered enormous rewards, but the pressure to solve the problem came from the counting houses. The eventual solution, involving precise maritime chronometers that could keep time against a known reference point, was a triumph of horology. But its birth was midwifed by the desperate need of commerce to tame the uncertainties of the ocean. This is a profound and often overlooked legacy. The merchant dynasties, in their relentless pursuit of profit and reduction of risk, became accidental patrons of the scientific revolution in geography and navigation. They created a financial incentive structure that demanded better data, better tools, and better understanding. The maps that unveiled the world, the instruments that conquered its oceans, were forged not in the name of pure knowledge, but in the name of competitive advantage and capital preservation. In redirecting the course of exploration, they also quietly redirected the course of science itself, proving that the engine of commerce could fund the light of discovery. The spiritual and the financial were never truly separate realms. While explorers planted crosses on distant shores, the most powerful cross in Christendom was being balanced on a ledger book in Rome. The Catholic Church was not just a spiritual authority, it was one of the wealthiest and most complex financial institutions in the world. Its revenue flowed in from every corner of Europe, tithes from peasants, donations from nobles, and the sale of indulgences. Managing this river of sacred capital required a banker of unparalleled skill and discretion. That role fell repeatedly to the Medici family. As papal bankers, they did not merely hold the church's money, they orchestrated its entire fiscal existence. They collected dues, transferred funds across borders to finance crusades or building projects, and even bankrolled the elections of new popes. This position granted them a form of influence that was both invisible and immense. A Medici agent in Rome could whisper in a cardinal's ear, shape the agenda of a council, or subtly guide the drafting of a critical document. And few documents were as critical as the papal bulls of the late 15th century. These decrees, issued by Pope Alexander VI, were the divine sanction for dividing the globe between Spain and Portugal at Tordesillas. While the treaty was negotiated by kings and diplomats, the papal authority that legitimized it flowed through channels lubricated by Medici finance. The family that helped fund the Renaissance also helped underwrite the legal and spiritual framework for carving up continents. This was power operating in a sacred register, where a ledger entry in Florence could influence a proclamation in Rome that redirected the destiny of millions across an ocean. The missionary priests who followed the conquistadors and traders were part of this same integrated system. Their voyage was often underwritten by the same merchant consortiums that funded the ships carrying soldiers and goods. Conversion was seen as a dual-purpose endeavor. On one level, it was a sincere spiritual duty, the saving of souls. On another, it was a profound exercise in social engineering. A converted population, brought under the umbrella of a unified church hierarchy, was viewed as a more predictable and governable one. Shared beliefs could ease the friction of trade, create a common moral framework that discouraged rebellion, and produce a labor force that accepted its place within a divinely ordained order. The missionary outpost and the company trading post were frequently two sides of the same colonial coin. This fusion created an ideological engine of terrifying efficiency. It allowed expansion to be framed not as raw greed or conquest, but as a holy mission, a mission civilisatrix. Every advance could be justified simultaneously in the language of profit for crown and investor, and in the language of salvation for the heathen. This moral covering was invaluable. It turned difficult questions of ethics and violence into matters of divine providence and necessary hardship on the path to enlightenment. A silver mine was not just a source of wealth, it was a means to fund the further spread of the faith. A plantation was not just an engine of suffering, it was a settled Christian community bringing order to a wild land. This powerful narrative, bankrolled by merchant capital and blessed by religious authority, made the engine of exploration and extraction almost unstoppable. It convinced those at home that their nation's expansion was righteous, and it provided a ready-made rationale for those on the frontier carrying it out. The quest for spices and silver could now be seen as part of God's own plan. The colonial city was built on a ledger entry. Its streets did not follow the organic paths of an old village, but the rigid grid of an accountant's efficiency, designed to move silver from mine to mint to ship as quickly as possible. This was the ripple effect of merchant capital, a force so powerful it did not just fund voyages, it molded the very societies born from them. The New World was not a simple copy of Europe transplanted across the ocean. It was a new and often harsh creation, its legal structures, its land patterns, and its social hierarchies all reflecting a single, overwhelming imperative: to generate a return on a transatlantic investment. Consider the mountain of Potosi. When the Spanish crown discovered its staggering silver veins, the news was a cause for celebration in the royal court, but it was a matter of urgent financial necessity in the banking houses of Genoa and Augsburg. Their massive loans were secured against the promise of that very silver. To extract it fast enough to service the towering debt, the colonial administrators implemented a system known as the meter. This was not a free labor market. It was a rotating draft that required indigenous communities to send a portion of their adult men to work in the mines for a set period. The work was grueling, and the conditions in the high altitude were severe, leading to profound hardship. Historians note that this system, conceived to satisfy distant creditors, reshaped entire regions, depopulating villages and altering centuries-old social structures, all to feed the insatiable financial engine abroad. The mountain itself was said to be hollowed out, its wealth flowing in a continuous stream to settle balance sheets the miners would never see. A similar story unfolded along the coast of Brazil, but here the crop was sugar. Establishing a sugar plantation was a capital-intensive endeavor. It required clearing vast tracts of land, constructing a mill, and acquiring expensive machinery and a large labor force. Portuguese planters rarely had such wealth on hand. They turned to merchant creditors, often Dutch financiers who were masters of the European sugar trade. The plantation was built on credit, and every aspect of its operation was optimized to repay that loan with interest. This economic logic dictated a specific and brutal social order, one of immense, isolated estates worked by enslaved individuals whose lives were calculated as units of production on the same ledger that tracked the yield of cane. The law itself bent to this financial reality. Land grants were issued not to encourage diverse, self-sufficient communities, but to create large, monolithic enterprises capable of generating a single export commodity at scale. Legal codes were developed to protect the property of the creditor and the planter, solidifying a social hierarchy with the merchant financier, though absent at the very top, the local planter as his managing agent in the middle, and a vast laboring class with no rights at the bottom. This was the true shape of the colonial world, a society engineered for extraction. Its cities were ports for export, its roads led to mines and plantations, and its people were organized into roles that served the financial pipeline back to Europe. The culture, the architecture, the very rhythm of life in these colonies echoed the metronome of debt repayment. So when we look at the grand cathedrals of Spanish America or the opulent mansions of Brazilian sugar barons, we are seeing not just colonial ambition, but the physical dividend paid on a successful overseas investment. The frontier was a factory, and its product was the capital that quietly, irrevocably redirected the modern world. But what if the map had been drawn by a different hand? Strip away the merchant bankers and their ledgers. Imagine a world where the age of exploration was funded entirely by the state, through the slow accumulation of tax revenue without a single line of private credit. This is not just a historical what-if, it is a lens that sharpens our view of the immense power those dynasties actually wielded. Without them, the entire endeavor would have unfolded at a different rhythm with a different heartbeat. The pace would have been glacial, dictated by the fiscal health of the kingdom, not the feverish speculation of a counting house. A monarch spending the people's money would have moved with immense caution. Each voyage would be a monumental budgetary line item, debated in councils, vulnerable to the shifting winds of court politics and the next war on the continent. There would be no frantic races to beat a rival's backed fleet, no desperate pushes into the unknown fueled by the need to show quarterly returns to distant investors. Exploration would advance in careful, deliberate steps, perhaps one major expedition per reign, not the constant stream of caravels and carracks that historically poured from Iberian ports. The goals themselves would have shifted. A state-funded voyage answerable to a broader concept of the realm might have prioritized different things. Strategic military outposts to secure sea lanes could have taken precedence over immediate spice grabs. Genuine scientific inquiry, the mapping of coastlines for its own sake, or the establishment of long-term agricultural colonies could have received funding that, in our reality, was always diverted toward the venture with the fastest possible payoff. The relentless focus on extraction, on finding the one resource that could instantly repay a loan with 300% interest, might have been tempered. Settlements might have grown slowly, focused on self-sufficiency and integration, rather than existing as remote, brutalized factories sending wealth back to a silent board of directors. This counterfactual highlights the single most defining pressure of the historical age, the debt clock. The merchant dynasties did not just provide money, they imposed a timeline. Their capital came with strings, and those strings were tied to a calendar of repayment. This created an engine of urgency that drove explorers and conquerors to act with a terrible swiftness. Every day a ship spent in port was a day of interest accruing. Every month without a shipload of silver or pepper was a month closer to financial ruin for its backers. This pressure translated directly into actions on the ground, a constant push for immediate, exploitable yield, often at a profound human cost. The character of the conquest, its haste and its hardness, was baked into the financial model. So when we look back at the speed and the sheer, transformative violence of that era, we are not just seeing the ambition of kings or the bravery of sailors. We are witnessing the cold, logical outcome of a system built on high-risk debt demanding high-speed returns. The merchant dynasties, therefore, did not merely fund the age. They set its frantic tempo and defined its often tragic priorities, proving that the source of the money can shape the soul of the history it creates. Yet at the very moment the Fuggers were consolidating their power in Europe, a fleet of unimaginable scale was sailing in the opposite direction. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming dynasty of China launched 7 monumental voyages under the command of Admiral Zheng He. To call them ships is an understatement. His largest vessels, known as treasure ships, were over 400 feet long, with 9 masts and multiple decks, carrying not just sailors but diplomats, scholars, and soldiers. They dwarfed anything Europe would build for centuries. These expeditions sailed from China across the Indian Ocean, reaching the coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. They exchanged gifts, established diplomatic ties, and brought back envoys from dozens of kingdoms to pay homage to the Ming Emperor. This was exploration on a breathtaking, state-sponsored scale. But its purpose was fundamentally different from the European model taking shape a few decades later. Zheng He's voyages were not funded by merchant bankers seeking a return on investment. They were financed entirely by the imperial treasury, a direct extension of the emperor's will. Their goal was not trade monopoly or resource extraction, but the projection of soft power, the awe-inspiring demonstration of Ming supremacy. They sought to incorporate distant lands into a vast, China-centered tributary system where foreign rulers acknowledged the emperor's superiority through ritual gift-giving. This was diplomacy as theater, and the stage was the entire known world. For a brief, glorious window, China commanded the seas, but then, in the 1430s, it all stopped. The voyages were cancelled, the great shipyards fell quiet, and many of the records were deliberately destroyed. The reason was a shift in internal court politics. A new faction gained influence, one that saw the treasure fleets as a colossal waste of imperial resources that should be directed toward defending the northern land borders. Since the entire enterprise was an expression of state power, when the state's priorities changed, the exploration simply ended. The voyages left no permanent financial infrastructure, no hungry class of investors demanding the next voyage, no self-perpetuating engine. They were a magnificent edifice built on sand, washed away by the next political tide. This stark contrast throws the European model into sharp, revealing relief. In Europe, exploration became permanent because it was not tethered to the whims of a single court or the changing priorities of a central state. It was tethered to something far more relentless, the logic of capital. The merchant dynasties provided an independent source of power and motivation. Even if one king lost interest, the bankers, with their eyes on global ledgers, would simply fund a rival. The project could not be cancelled by a political decree because it was not a state project at all. It was a distributed network of financial interests. The need for perpetual growth, for new markets and new resources to feed the cycle of debt and return, made the engine of expansion unstoppable. Zheng He's fleet showcased what a centralized empire could achieve when it focused its immense resources. Europe's scattered caravels showcased what a decentralized, competitive, and financially driven system would inevitably do: expand forever, not because a single ruler willed it, but because the balance sheets demanded it. One system produced a breathtaking but temporary spectacle. The other produced a permanent reshaping of the world, for better and for worse, because its fuel was not imperial pride but compound interest. That same relentless logic of capital still structures our world today. The merchant dynasties may have faded into history, but the financial architecture they helped design remains the invisible framework of our global economy. The concepts they pioneered did not disappear with their family fortunes. They simply evolved, scaling up to a level those Renaissance bankers could never have dreamed of. The sovereign debt that entangled the Fuggers with the Habsburgs is now a multi-trillion-dollar international bond market, where nations borrow from global investors with a few keystrokes. The corporate charter that granted the Welsers a colony is the direct ancestor of the legal frameworks that allow a single multinational company to operate in over 100 countries, navigating different laws and labor markets with the same detached efficiency. And the joint stock company, perfected by the Dutch and English to manage risk, is now the standard model for every major corporation on the planet, from tech giants to energy conglomerates. When you buy a share of stock, you are participating in a system those merchant families helped invent, betting on the future yield of an enterprise you will never see, just as they bet on the return of a spice ship they would never board. The separation of investor from operational risk, a principle they mastered to fund brutal ventures from a distance, is now a fundamental tenet of modern finance. It allows pension funds in one country to own shares in mining operations in another, with the returns flowing smoothly across borders while the complex realities on the ground remain abstract figures in an annual report. This is their most profound legacy. They transformed the world from a collection of isolated kingdoms into a single, interconnected marketplace, and they built the first tools to manage it. The flow of commodities, whether it was 16th century pepper or 21st century semiconductors, still follows paths of least financial resistance, dictated by futures contracts and currency exchanges that would look familiar in form, if not in speed, to a Medici agent. Our entire system of globalized trade and finance is the digital, high-speed descendant of their ledgers. The quiet redirection they began, steering ships with capital, now steers the flow of data, goods, and entire industries. We live inside the system they built, a world where the map is still, and always has been, written in the language of investment and return. We began this journey by reimagining the age of exploration, and we end it with a transformed understanding. This was an age forged as much in the quiet ledger book as on the stormy high seas. The merchant dynasties we have traced were the hidden architects, using their immense wealth not as an end, but as a lever to quietly redirect the entire course of history toward channels of profit. Their story is a powerful and enduring reminder. Behind the grand historical narratives of kings and conquerors, behind the flags planted on distant shores, often lie the calculated, silent movements of capital and commerce. The next time you look at a world map, remember that its contours were not only discovered by the courage of adventurers, they were also financed and therefore fundamentally shaped by the decisions made in bankers' offices hundreds of miles from the coast. The past whispers to us that money has always been a mapmaker. If this journey into the hidden economics of history has captivated you, consider delving deeper. Subscribe for more content that uncovers the unseen forces quietly steering our shared past, and we would love to hear your thoughts. In the comments below, share which modern financial powers you believe might be redirecting the contours of our own future.